All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a truly fascinating overlap between theology, mythology, and biology. Throughout human history, we have been absolutely terrified of the invisible forces that can invade us, change us, and just completely consume us from the inside out. But the way we describe those invaders, well, that has shifted radically over the centuries. Today, we're going strictly by the historical texts, medical journals, and theological writings from our sources to explore a really startling historical parallel.
And that brings us to the central investigative mystery of today's deep dive. We are looking at this purely through the lens of historical literature. So here's the wild question. Could ancient descriptions of demons and demonic possession actually have been early human encounters with parasitic infections? I know, it sounds a bit out there at first, but as we'll see through the source material, the language and the symptoms of spiritual corruption and biological infestation overlap in ways that are just impossible to ignore.
This brilliantly illustrates why this topic hits so close to home. The quote here from our cultural research sources points out a really universal dread. Across the globe, from the Indian subcontinent to medieval Europe to traditional African American cultures, the fear of parasites literally wriggles its way through human history. We are inherently deeply revolted by the idea of being invaded and consumed by internal forces. It taps straight into our deepest vulnerabilities as living, breathing creatures.
Section 1. Invaders of the body. According to the theological frameworks, like the ones outlined in the Andrews University text, the demonic is defined as a state of being possessed, or fully under the influence of demons, which are viewed as satanic emissaries. It's essentially a condition where an invisible entity inhabits the human body, completely overriding the victim's autonomy and taking total, terrifying control. When we look specifically at biblical accounts detailing these spirits of infirmity, the physical and mental manifestations are extreme. We're talking about victims experiencing severe lunacy, being physically vexed or bruised. They would inexplicably fall into fire and water, foam at the mouth, exhibit completely unnatural physical strength, gnash their teeth, and generally just pine away or physically decay. It paints a vivid picture of intense, agonizing affliction.
Section 2. Symptoms of the demonic versus early medicine.
Fast forward a bit. Based on the historical research of early modern science, roughly around 1650 to 1810, medical professionals were trying their best to make sense of these extreme bodily afflictions, but without modern diagnostic tools. And get this, they actually believed that parasitic worms didn't just stay in the gut. They documented beliefs that these worms could breed way outside the intestines, literally invading the brain, the ears, the heart, the liver. Yes, they even thought a toothache was a worm. Because they believed worms were in the brain, they started diagnosing extreme physical and mental symptoms, things like epilepsy and sudden madness, as massive worm infestations.
When you put these two historical viewpoints side by side, the overlap is just staggering. On one hand, biblical accounts of supernatural possession describe spirits of infirmities causing foaming fits, lunacy, and decay. On the other hand, early biological science describes worms invading the brain and causing epilepsy, madness, and totally unexplainable physical torment. The symptoms are virtually identical. The only thing that's changed is the diagnosis, from a spiritual demon to a physical worm.
Section 3. The parasitic paraloth.
Now, our source texts reveal a totally fascinating linguistic shift. Did you know the word parasite wasn't even applied to worms or non-human creatures until the 18th and 19th centuries? It's true. Before that, it was strictly a religious or social term used to describe actual human beings who basically fed off others in a social setting. It wasn't until much later that science borrowed the word to describe a biological reality.
But once it was adopted by biology, a parasite became defined not just as a specific thing, but as an actual relationship. Scientifically, it's a living other whose entire method of survival requires dependency. It siphons off nutrients, directly harming the host by taking far, far more than it ever gives. It is the ultimate breach of bodily boundaries.
Section 4. Serpents, worms, and sin.
Historically speaking, the words we use for these creatures, like worm or its Latin counterpart vermis, were incredibly broad catch-alls. They didn't just mean a tiny harmless earthworm. Back then, these terms encompassed bugs, vermin, snakes, and even mythological dragons. So when ancient texts speak of the serpent or the dragon, like the old serpent Satan in the garden, it's super easy to see why early cultures might linguistically and conceptually blur the lines between the biological wriggling worm inside the body and the grand theological serpent of sin. Both are invasive, boundary-breaching creatures.
Mapping these concepts out reveals a near-perfect reflection.
In theology, you have the grand adversary, the serpent. In biology, you have the wriggling helminth or worm. In biblical text, you've got the spiritual corruption of sin. In biology, you have the literal physical decay of the host. In theology, the body is taken over by a demonic emissary. In biology, it's overtaken by a parasitic invader. It is wild how the metaphors of spiritual corruption map almost perfectly onto the hard biological reality of parasites.
But to be fair, it's important to note that not everyone saw these biological worms simply as demons or instruments of divine wrath. As early science progressed, some researchers began looking at them quite differently. Our texts quote Dr. Durham, an early scientist, who looked at parasitic worms and saw not a demon, but a manifest demonstration of the infinite creator. He actually saw them as a wondrous, if slightly disturbing, part of the animal world's incredibly intricate design.
Section 5. Biology meets the supernatural.
All right, let's bring it back to today. Modern biomedicine is very, very clear in its distinctions. It emphatically views parasites as a material otherness. They are physical organisms with their own DNA. They are definitely not spontaneously generated evil, and they are not demonic possession. Modern science entirely separates the physical, biomedical reality of helminths and parasites from any supernatural or theological frameworks. Plus, there was a major biological reality check against equating demons entirely with parasites. As our sources point out, not all parasites are worms. Nature is way more diverse than that. There are parasitic protozoa, fungi, and arthropods. There are ectoparasites, like fleas and ticks, that live on the outside of the body, not the inside. Even barnacles act as parasites to their hosts, and they certainly don't look anything like wriggling snakes. So, biologically speaking, the exclusive serpent metaphor kind of falls apart when you look at the wider natural world.
Furthermore, our texts point out a really interesting modern misconception. In modern medicine, we often mentally relegate these worms to tropical medicine, acting like they're just a disease of the other or something that only happens far away. But actually, they are a prosaic, totally global part of everyday life. They are incredibly common right here in the West, particularly in our most beloved companions, our household pets. We constantly treat our dogs and cats for heartworm and intestinal parasites, so this ancient, seemingly terrifying threat might literally be curled up asleep on your rug right now.
Which leaves us with this final, profound question. Whether an ancient text describes it as a spiritual demonic emissary, or a modern medical textbook describes it as a biological helminth, at the core of all this history, are we humans simply terrified of our own fragility? It seems that across all time, our absolute deepest fear is the realization that we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable to being invaded, changed, and consumed by an other. It's an absolutely fascinating look at the intertwining history of faith, fear, and science. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and keep asking those big questions.